Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 2025 conference, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, National Conference on Ending Homelessness. I would like to take a land acknowledgement before we start the program. We would like to begin with the land acknowledgement that the 2025 National Conference on Ending Homelessness is taking place on unceded indigenous lands. The Ghanaian Haga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Johor Gay, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with the indigenous and other peoples from coast to coast. With this, I'd like to welcome us to this session on approaches to innovation toward homelessness reduction. We have two presenters. We have Corey and Ian taking the presentations. I would just like to tell us a bit about the session. The session explores how to identify and scale innovative solutions to end homelessness by breaking down system complexities and focusing on what works. Participants will hear three distinct approaches: a Canadian solution lab fostering creative problem solving, an interactive activity to navigate the complexity of homelessness, and practical takeaways from community solutions in the US. Together, these presentations offer tools and insights to drive broader lasting impact. With this, I'd like to invite Corey to take the first presentation. Corey is from the community work. Corey came to community work when he was asked to join the board of directors of a grassroots community organization in Halifax. And that's about the age of 19, working without knowing about it at the time. Something changed inside of him forever, and he began a lifelong journey of systems change work. Since then, he has lived in a number of different cities across Canada and worked in worked a dizzying array of jobs, from farmer to conference director, before returning to Moncton, New Brunswick, where he has proudly helped found two social purpose not-for-profit, launched the region's first lived experience advisory table on housing, and is eager to continue learning from, collaborating with, and participating in his communities, whether local, provincial, national, or bigger. He's eager to bring his skills to communities across Canada in working together to end homelessness, and is excited to work in collaboration to make real, meaningful, sustainable change. When he's not making business a big fuss about system change, when he is not busy making a big fuss about systems change and human-centered design, he likes early mornings on the Fondly Coast, cooperative board games, giant piles of unread books, small trucks, and big dogs. He currently lives by himself in Mikamki, I hope I got the pronunciation. Yeah, in the city of Moncton. Please join me in welcoming Corey.
Thank you so much, PC. Thank you so much. It's a treat to be here in front of you all. This is not the title of the session that we're in. This is just the title of my presentation. You are in the Innovative Strategies to Reduce Homelessness session. And if that's where you want to be, that's where you are, and that's the right place. And if that's not where you want to be, some of you were in my session before where we did play a cooperative board game about reducing homelessness, and you probably remember me saying, I'm not your dad and I'm not your boss. So if you're in the wrong session, now's a great time to double down or get out. So I am joining you, as BC had said, from just outside of Moncton, New Brunswick, in Signictic, Mi'kma'ki. So Signictic is one of 7 districts of Mi'kmaq territory. And I want to talk a little bit about that before digging in, because it's important that a land acknowledgement not just be a recital at the beginning of a session. And so what that means to me coming in is that my family came here just a couple of generations ago. My father was born in Europe. His father fled Slovakia as it was being annexed by the USSR. He came here as a refugee. He came here seeking safety from Soviet annexation at the time. He was lucky to have landed in a place that offered safety, that offered refuge, that offered certainty for his future. And we live now in Signictic, that's the drainage district, one of 7 districts of Mi'kmaq. Where we are is in the salt marshes, where the waters run out. That extends from what's now Fundy National Park, along the Fundy coast and up towards the Acadian coastline through the salt marshes, where the waters drain out into the Bay of Fundy and into the Northumberland Strait. And that district system was a governance system. It still is a governance system, in spite of the ways that colonialism has shaped things out there. And those 7 districts spanned what is now also known as Nova Scotia, PEI, and those districts make up an entirely different judiciary system, an entirely different legal system, and they are governed by one of the oldest signed treaties from 1725, amended through 1752, the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. And why I mention that is twofold. One is that those treaties, when we hear the phrase, we are all treaty people, there's a call to action. There's a call to know what those things mean. There's a call to honor those. And that treaty was signed that explicitly did not include land cessation. It explicitly stated a collaborative shared future, shared resources, and shared interests. And when I say that that treaty has been dishonored repeatedly for 300 years now. And that idea of shared land, shared resources, and shared interest is important for those of us in this work, for those of us where Indigenous homelessness is a much overrepresented segment of homelessness at large, for those of us who have come to this land for any number of reasons, by choice, by ancestry, those who have dwelled in this land forever, those who have come here within recent generations, like my family. And I have no doubt that if that had happened differently, and if New Brunswick, as we know it now, was still under Indigenous sovereignty, that it still could have offered refuge to my family too, and that not be an either or, but that both can be true. And so coming into that, I also have my own lived experience, as you heard during the intro. I was homeless in my late teens and early 20s. I bring that into the work, and I came to this because I also have the privilege of working for a consulting firm before coming into the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, where I now work. And we got some money from the feds to do some really cool work on lived experience involvement and how to do things in a good way to reduce homelessness. And I'm going to talk to you about that. We're all still in the right room? Can you hear me okay? Great. Bryn couldn't be here today. He's in Ottawa with his lovely wife and their little cat, Earl. And Bryn, I had the incredible privilege also of knowing him since I was 3 years old, and we share the same birthday on July 15th. He helped us build this lab, and I'm going to present his parts for him because I love him very much, and even though he couldn't be here, he's really here in the results of what we did. So I'm going to talk about a solutions lab that we did out in Moncton, New Brunswick. I want to talk about what is a solutions lab, because sometimes people nod really knowingly and say, oh, I've done a million of those. And sometimes people say, oh, like biology? Did you do chemistry about homelessness? And I say, no, not at all. We're going to talk about our lab, Shelter in the Storm. What are some of the core principles? How we did it differently, why we did it differently, and what came out of it. And then my good friend Ian, who I met 5 minutes ago, is going to come up and talk a little bit about some of his work, and then we'll have a Q&A with all of you afterwards. Everyone's still in the right room? You want to be here? Rock and roll. So when we started this lab, was shortly after the pandemic lockdowns had begun to lift. We had a lot of people who were in a really, really intensely front-facing sector who had moved through all of the COVID lockdowns, literally saving lives, working in shelters, working in harm reduction sites, at times when many of the rest of the world was moved into online meetings and discovering all the joys and pains of doing Teams and Zoom. A lot of people were still literally out there in the field doing the work. And Moncton, where I lived at the time, I lived very, very much downtown Moncton, right behind a drop-in center, in a house that Bryn and I actually owned together as friends for 12 years. we saw that landscape change very, very drastically. And Moncton has seen some of the most severe declines in vacancy, some of the most severe increases in the cost of rentals, and some of the most severe increases in the amount of unsheltered homelessness in the entire country over the last 5 years. 143% in the average cost of acquiring a rental. 90% of our vacancy rates have been taken up, almost all of it from low end of naturally occurring rentals. So that means when I moved to Moncton, 9.7% vacancy. 1 out of every 10 houses was available. It was below 1% when we ran our lab. 0.9% was the last CMHC reported stat for our lab. So we lost most of it. 20 naturally occurring low-income rentals were visible from my front porch that were demolished. If that gives you any indication, both of the neighborhood that I was living in at the time when we did it and what happened. So we saw absolute disasters on terms of health, human rights, human experience, shelter, mental health, substance use. Everything associated with the sector was popping off. And so we wanted to do a lab that worked on that. So we applied to the CMHC NHS Solutions Labs funding. Does anyone here know what that is? Have any of you gotten Solutions Lab money from CMHC before? Hi, we should talk later. I love yapping with other people who did labs. And they give you money. It's short term and it's pretty small amounts. In the scheme of money to end homelessness, it's a couple $100,000, so we're not building houses with it. But it's designed to look at a problem in a community that has not been solved by the tools in that community and say, what does not exist here but could, and how might we learn from it, scale it up, and export it out to other communities, because our victory could be replicable elsewhere. Our wins can help others. And so we started off with that in mind, and we are asked to create a question at the beginning. And so ours was pretty generically, which factors can we identify and address together in order to favor housing solutions which are stable, secure, and affordable for generations to come? So I wanted it to be predictable and reliable for people. I wanted it to be resistant to things like surprise rent evictions, policy changes, getting rug pulled out by a landlord, selling it to somebody else. I needed it to be affordable, and I needed it to be generationally affordable. And many people said, oh, you're working with seniors. I'm like, well, not what I mean by generational. I want to be able to plan for future generations. I need housing so secure I can think about having kids in it. I can think about inviting my parent in. I could think about planning a life with a partner in it. I want housing that is not a chaos factor, but a stability factor, that when people move into housing, they should say, great, I don't have to think about that again. Which sounds obvious, but when you have the amount of places that do housing as programs rather than housing as leases, transitional only things, highly conditional, we said housing first or nothing. We wanted it all in. And then we also had the incredible joy of knowing that there was a federal, provincial, and municipal election all coming up soon. The election municipally was a little bit longer out, but New Brunswick was doing massive municipal reform at the time as well. So they were changing the responsibility landscape in the districts for municipalities. So we said we need something policy agnostic. We needed something that could survive a shakeup on every level of government and not a report that can turn into the world's best paper airplane and thrown out the window as soon as the new administration hits. So we looked at operational, we looked at scalable, we looked at easy, and we wanted to understand that through the lens, the second part of our question, which qualities will these solutions require in order to ensure they can connect equitably and accessibly with those in need of timely and intensive wraparound supports? So we wanted to rock this lab with the folks who needed the support the most, and determining what would work. The qualities were policy agnostic, rapid, operational, and highly resistant to change. We wanted things that could survive in any administration that we knew tipped the scale towards something a little bit better for those who needed the support. Y'all with me? So the NHS Solutions Labs, you can access these slides later when we share everything out. These are nice little hyperlinks if you really want to dig deep into this. They don't have a funding application open for them right now, but we all know how government funding works. It comes in little cycles, and maybe there'll be some more coming up, and I'd love to chat with you about it. But they wanted to have these as a rapid, replicable set of labs. So you could prototype over a year and a half and say, what doesn't exist in our community but could, and what can we do about it? So they've probably fired off about 50 or 60 of these labs. We used the frame here, basically, that it helps us examine complex problems from multiple viewpoints with multiple streams of information to get a common understanding. it's not just a one side, two side. It's not both sides of the coin. It's a complex, multi-sided die. If any of you ever play Dungeons & Dragons, it's one of those weird little multi-sided dice that get rolled out there. And every perspective is a part of it. So we did a lot of work working with frontliners, working with middle management, working with policymakers, working with funders, and an enormous amount of work at the overdose prevention site, at the peer supportive housing, at the youth drop-in, chatting with folks who are receiving those services, because nobody knows how the system broke better than the person who was let down when it broke. And so we worked heavily with folks with lived and living experience. We had, I think it was 87 people that we worked with. We paid living wage. There's no $10 Tim Hortons gift card situation. We found the living wage for New Brunswick and we offered that in straight cash. We bought people lunch. We took them out like we would a consultant that we wanted to work with who knew a lot about a thing and said, let me buy you lunch, let's hang out, tell me everything I need to know. I'll talk more about that later because that's the conclusion here. I'm doing a little bit of foreshadowing with that. But we wanted that, and so we worked with everything from frontliners. There was not a single executive director in the room for most of it. All of them that were participated, we asked permission to borrow some of their staff and said, hey, do you have a caseworker who can come hang out with me every month for the next year and a half? Hey, do you have somebody doing support who can come in? Is there anybody in your peer team who wants to come in and work on this prototypes with us? And I said, I want to see you halfway, three-quarters, and at the end. But we wanted to make sure senior leadership could do strategic level direction. They knew where it was going. They knew how to adopt it. And the people who had to live with the results in a bias towards action in an operational context knew what they were building. Because the people who were actually implementing this stuff were the folks who had to know it inside and out. And the folks who oversaw it, funded it, governed it, and gave it strategic direction need to know where it was going and what was accomplishing and how they could align it. So we made sure that people got involved at the right level. And that was really fun, and it was really weird. And it was a lot of frontliners first times hanging out with us. And it was a lot of folks, you know, when we were working at the overdose prevention site and some of the drop-ins were like, it took us a little bit to get over the hump of telling you what you want to hear and just being like, okay, no, you can actually tell me how the person sitting in the front room at this place has let you down devastatingly and where that happened and why and what we can do to change it to make it work better. And it was really fun and weird and horrible and tough and incredible. So these were kind of our pieces. We wanted the lab to be the hub. We didn't own any of it. When it was done, none of that was intellectual property that we owned. We have it in an open source report. You can read it all afterwards. You can take the entire thing, copy paste every one of the prototypes word for word, and put them into a funding application for all I care. It's not me. It was built by, for, and with community and deserves to live there. And it was all designed to be rapid and actionable. And that kind of makes sense. But we made sure that we had to be anchored in it. We worked a lot with community accountability. We used the community first, last, and always principle, different versions of that, you know, by, for, and with, nothing about us without us, the many different ways of saying that. But if a solution's going to community, it should involve the community. And if it doesn't, then that's a really great time to buy a mirror and spend some time staring into it. So we wanted things that the community actually cared about, their priorities and the desire and the will. They needed to want it, like it, and be able to do it. It needed to be based on knowledge that we knew was good enough to hold water. And everyone here who's worked in the sector over the last 5 years has known that the sector moves fast, especially in the last 5 years. So we needed good potential to sustain, and we looked a lot to our friends and peers in other communities, Halifax, Ottawa, and Saskatoon, particularly where we had some incredible boots on the ground helping us out with the Ottawa Alliance and their expert steering team. If any of you had the pleasure of meeting some of them running the lived experience streams at last year's CAH conference, they were delightful. My friend Francisco, who actually works with us at the Alliance now, did a really, really good lab in Saskatoon on hidden homelessness. And I was really hoping he'd be presenting on it this year, but you can find him later on out there, Francisco Urrutia, with our team. And then Halifax, learning from North End Community Health, learning from Sharp's program and some of the other things they were doing down there, where we said other people know more than us, so let's lean into it. I've never had an original thought in my life. Everything I know has been thought before by somebody smarter, and my job is just to be the center. So we worked a lot with that. We worked a lot with coordinated access. We worked a lot with by-name data. We said everybody out there has a piece of the puzzle. This is a massive, multi-sided die, and no one can see every facet at the same time, but we can work with that. And when we're done, the community needs to be able to hold it afterwards. So we had a really fun thing going on. Are any of you from Moncton? Do any of you know what Moncton is like, or have you spent time there? I see some nodding in the front row, which is really lovely. Yeah, love that. Thanks for being up close to me, guys. A lot of things got identified twice. We had a lot of places where frontliners and middle management in our lab ended up coming in 7 months later and said, oh, our executive director is working on this at the same time. Like, should we stop? I was like, no, double down. If they're doing it out there and the board is mandating that your ED build out a project and they have a funding application in the pipe, let's learn as much about this problem as we can and give it to them and learn from them in return to go the other direction. So we saw a lot of work and we said, let's not duplicate, let's parallel. If they're going the same direction, let's find out what they're doing and not do it, but do things around it. Learn what the blind spots are, learn out what the missing pieces are, build on it so that two folks moving in the same direction can carry twice as much going into it rather than just say we're trying to merge into each other's lanes and cause a car crash. So a 24-hour drop-in got ideated in our lab and by our coordinated access table. Youth tracking on HIFIS we saw as a major gap where a lot of youth would age out of care for certain provincial programs at age 16, but weren't allowed into the shelters until they were age of majority at 19. So we had a 16 to 18-year-old gap for a lot of youth. At the same time, the Opening the Gate Committee was working on that at the same time. We saw furniture banks. We saw better integration with healthcare systems. We saw one of our peer supportive housing that was partially supported by folks in our healthcare system, but referred to by folks who used by name data or the homelessness system, and said, we need these two things to talk to each other. So we found a lot of things that duplicated other work and said, let's learn and dig in deeper. And that best ideas can't exist in isolation. None of this is a silo. All of it is ecosystemic. And if we build a silo, we're just missing out on awareness of what's happening around us. So we said this can't be a research project. This is relational, and we need to think meta-relational. We need to know how we relate to the relationships in our community. We need to understand how we work together. It's ecosystemic, not just systemic. If we do research, we need to say, how does it live? What does it nourish? What does it feed on? What feeds it? What happens when it dies? And can it at least, if it dies, if our project doesn't survive, can it at least rot in a way that lets fungus grow up and start the new generation of sprouts from it? The drive to innovate is everywhere. Innovation is a buzzword, and it is horrible when it ends up just speaking in circles. And so we said, our innovation can't take priority over our impact. If at the end of line something happens, we win. And if at the end of line we have 17 great ideas and none of them take off, we've failed. So 6 prototypes are still implemented and running. 24-hour drop-in space is still up. Youth are permanently tracked on HIFIS. A landlord and tenancy coordination team is still out there. A housing, skills, and construction social enterprise partnering between a shelter, a college, and a credentialing program is getting off the ground to launch. We are seeing some really, really big stuff as well on secondary traumatic stress training, and the furniture bank is barely floating, but it's floating. And people are getting furniture way more easily from a centralized source with distribution than they ever did through all of the little handout, drop-in, pick up what you need situations that were around. We have a social inclusion programming, public information mobilizing, a healthcare and nursing integration, and a tiny home community that are working their way forward. I have a lot of complex opinions on tiny homes, and if any of you want to talk about those with me after, find me in the hall. And then a number of things around discharge planning, operational coordination, hidden homelessness tracking, and things that are getting out on that field as well that are ready for adoption and just waiting for a home. We've coordinated across prototypes with Ottawa, Halifax, and Saskatoon, are in regular contact with multiple other labs, 30 agencies, and we've obtained follow-through funding from 3 partners because the goal was to show you something that any agency could pick up and say, this works, give me $100,000 so I can do it. And so when I said you can take our briefs and apply for funding with them, I really do mean that because we have been doing it over and over and over again. One of the really exciting things that came out of it was actually we have founded the region's first lived experience advisory table as a fully incorporated nonprofit with paid staff at a living wage, doing fee-for-service consulting, using that same theory of change that we started at the beginning that said, this is a multi-sided issue, and it's a sector that relies heavily on academic and professional experience, which are valid and true and show you two out of many facets, and that lived experience is recognized heavily in the sector, but not compensated, not integrated, and not relied upon as thoroughly as the other two in making strategy and in making long-term decisions. So we've created something to help make that happen too. We built this lab very much by, for, and with. It was an honor to be able to lead it as somebody with my own lived experience and also from the posture as a federally funded consultant, which let me have a foot in both worlds in a pretty wild way, to be totally honest. And working with folks like Bryn, who had a lot of systems knowledge. But one of the big things that we wanted to talk about was not letting it die on the vine. And so the lab funding runs you through a 1.5 year timeline, give or take, 18 months. We wanted to make sure things are open source. So these are hot links. You'll be able to get those afterwards in the slide notes. But we have our appendix, rundown 2 to 4 page briefs of every single prototype, including the budgets for the ones that got funding, some of the follow-through information, all of our partnership structures that we built out, who was partnered, why, what they did, radio interviews, media bites, a podcast episode, the whole 9 yards. And information on how we followed through. We got some funding from CBDC to help develop the social enterprise, to hire some experts. We brought out my friend Sean Loney, who helped build Winnipeg off the ground and up and running, doing construction skills development with folks after discharge. We got some follow-through funding from CMHC to seed the lived experience table. We got some funding from the City of Moncton to do ongoing development of some of our prototyping. And we are beginning to actually do some work with a newly founded nonprofit, the Community Incubator out there, to begin to hatch some of these ideas. So a new social impact incubator that's begun is looking at following through and developing more work. And so when we said things need to look ecosystemically, when we said that we need to understand that this lives on without us, that the lab was a hub, but that it wasn't the whole wheel, those were the things we looked at. That's why we say it was not a research project. And so some of the other documentation that we have, our CMHC report, is way more dry, but it's out there too if you're into that kind of reading. And the lab that we partnered with in Saskatoon, doing their typologies of hidden homelessness, helped us understand a lot of things that we didn't know about youth homelessness and youth particularly who don't trust the system and youth who just don't see themselves as homeless. I'm just sleeping on my boy's couch for a couple months. Like, okay, you got a roof, you even have a key, but you don't have tenant protections. You don't have stability. There's certain things. And so Francisco did a lot of work on that we ended up using to inform a lot of our concepts of lived experience engagement and of our hidden homelessness for youth on HIFA's piece that said, right, just because we know something the system doesn't mean that other people don't know things that we don't. And we think about that all the time because this lab is now done and it's reported on and it's over. And as far as the federal funders are concerned, it's complete. But those 6 prototypes that are still living in community are still fighting for funding. They're still working to engage people. They're still doing deep work to transform. And so I wanted to talk about this because I think that we were able to do something really fortunate. We were able to do something really exciting. And we were able to do something really, really good and impactful when we looked at our community and said, I know a little bit, but every single one of you knows more than me about something. What is it, and what is the kind of stone soup, potluck, everybody bring an ingredient kind of approach? And our role was really just to be the chef in the kitchen, to take all of those ingredients and say, we need to cook something nourishing, and we need to make sure that the recipe doesn't get left behind when we leave the room. So that was the really big part of it. Initially, there were supposed to be 3 presentations, so I planned to speak for 20 minutes, but that second one, the interactive tool, is not here today. So I think that was about 25, 28 minutes. It was about as much as I planned to say. It's a treat to be up here. I'm sorry you don't get the second presentation, but Ian, are you ready to come up next? Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we're going to do this switcheroo here. Let's see. Do this without breaking anything. just my thumb drive here. Is this, yeah? Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here with you and to not be in the US right now. And I say that semi-jokingly, but in real sincerity, I get to do a lot of work with both our domestic partners and our international partners, and we have a lot of conversations about kind of the conditions of what we're experiencing. And it's not until you get out of that that you realize like how serious things are. So it's just really great to be here. My presentation is really focused on some of the work we've been doing in the US. Some of it may not translate as directly one-to-one, but happy to have conversation with the Q&A about how this does or does not land with your contexts. So when I say Built for Zero, I'm going to be referencing Built for Zero USA. And so everything I'm talking about is a US context. We have done some of this work with British Columbia, and my colleague Aaron was not able to join, but happy to follow up with connections later on. So again, Ian Fletcher, I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado, in the Mountain West, traditional homelands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho. I have been with Community Solutions about 5 years, and I direct our team that works on international, state, and regional intermediaries or backbones. And so depending on how that translates for you, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. So Community Solutions is really the org that started a lot of the work that some of you know through Built for Zero. We started in about 2012, 2013 with the 25 Cities campaign. The idea was, how do we reduce homelessness in the 25 cities with the largest unsheltered, chronic, and veteran homeless experience? And then that merged into the 100,000 Homes campaign. How do we get 100,000 people across the US housed? A lot of lessons there where communities across the US housed over 100,000 people, and homelessness did not go down because the systems were not accounting for what we call inflow. And so that gave birth to Zero 2016, where the organization thought we can end veteran homelessness in like 75 communities in about a year and a half. Ended up doing that in one community. Of those 75, a lot of lessons learned. And so that Zero 2016 created what is now Built for Zero, so building systems for zero homelessness. Since that time, this is actually outdated now already. We've got about 180 communities across the US participating in Built for Zero, just shy of 200,000 individuals housed. Our data systems, it's really hard to track households, so we know that there's more people as part of that data set, but partners, spouses, family members, dependents are not included in that data. We've seen about 14 communities have really ended homelessness for at least one population. 77 of those have what we would designate as that quality real-time data. So they have the truest picture they can possibly have of who's experiencing homelessness at any given point. For us, at the federal level, we use an annual snapshot called the point in time that a lot of communities rely on, but it is really problematic as a data source, especially when comparing year over year. And so we're trying to go from that snapshot into a movie that any day of the year you can ask, how many people are experiencing homelessness? Who are they? What are their needs? Who's coming into the system? Who's exiting the system? And where are they going and where are they coming from? We've seen some really measurable reductions in what I would call particularly trying times. So communities who've gotten really savvy with very limited resources have been able to do that. Additionally, we also work with Australia. My colleague Taylor, who some of you know, is here, and she is based in Australia. We get to work with the Canadian Alliance, Denmark, France, and the United Kingdom. So that's kind of our international team as well. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the international work, but I will just say, Canada is certainly our bright spot and has leapfrogged the US in so many ways, homelessness and not. And so just kudos to all the work that's been happening here as well. What I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is an updated version of our kind of Built for Zero theory of change, which is what we have learned over those 10 plus years, like these kind of core elements of what it takes to end homelessness in a place. And a place can be a state or province, it can be a region, it can be a municipality or a community. And the success of places that have done this are really hinging on these two kind of elements. The first that every community has to have are these four foundational capabilities. Within that, there's the backbone organization. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time discussing today. But the other elements are strategic partnerships. So that's the work across both sectors and organizations to work together. A shared goal or end state. Are we all rowing in the same direction towards the same thing? And does everyone understand where they are on the boat? And comprehensive data, that real-time, person-specific data that helps drive actual reductions in homelessness. And then the other piece is these 5 enabling conditions, all of which are both necessary and sufficient. So you have to have all of them. You can't do this and not have one of them. So supportive policy, so that is federal, state, local policies that both support affordable housing development, support people who are currently in crisis, prevent people from becoming housing unstable. A shared public narrative. This is a big one. The belief that ending homelessness is possible, and that there are people doing the work to make that happen. Funding and resources. So we know what works. We have to scale it accordingly to not just have it work for veterans. It has to work for all people, right, who are experiencing homelessness. Housing supply. It's not enough to have an architect build a grand system that works really well, assuming you have housing units available. You have to have those housing units available. And then finally, political will. And similar to what Corey was sharing, like that has to transcend political shifts, and that it cannot be just, well, this administration does this, and then the next administration comes in and does something completely different, setting the work back many, many years, and partners spinning their heads going, what are we even doing? And the worst of all, people experiencing homelessness going from, well, I was able to be outside, and now I'm being swept into some other jurisdiction, or now I'm being incarcerated, whatever that looks like. So I'm going to spend the most of the conversation just around this idea of a backbone organization. This idea of a backbone comes from a few sources. The one that's most credited is this article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review around collective impact as a model. And really this idea that regardless of the systemic challenge that a community is trying to overcome, whether that is a campaign on tobacco cessation or public health work around harm reduction or an education program to ensure that kids kind of cradle to career have opportunities. It doesn't matter what the kind of topic is. What matters is that this framework tends to follow the same kind of approach, whatever you're doing. And so we applied that and said, how could we take a collective impact approach and apply that to homeless systems change? And in our case, in particular, within states where you have many actors, some of whom realize that they are on the stage and some of them who don't, some of whom want to grab the mic every 5 minutes, and others who don't understand that where they're at is where they need to be. And when we talk about the states, I'll just name them in the US. So we are currently working with Colorado, Maine, Kansas, Maryland, New Jersey, Washington, and Illinois. Those are our 7 states. And they have a wide array of large cities, rural areas, the whole gamut. And that's on purpose because we wanted our model to be replicable enough that it can be applied anywhere. So that it's not just, states on the East Coast or states with a progressive governor, right? We really wanted this model to be applicable. And so this comes from, kind of collective impacts. How many people here are familiar with the Tamarack Institute? Great. So a lot of the work that they're doing, very similar to, some of the partners we have based in the US. And so what we've really learned is that a backbone team can help vertically align the efforts to end homelessness. And so often at the community level, we see communities that are doing really good work, but the policies, the resources, maybe the narrative are not happening above them. And so the backbone can help align those things to help clear the path for the successes in those local communities. And so we really are working to both either identify or stand up backbone partners in these different states. I'll talk about how some of them are charities or nonprofits, some of them are government departments, some of them are coalitions. It's a variety of different ways that you can organize around that. But when we talk about a backbone, we're really talking about a structure that fulfills these core functions that facilitate action and accountability across a place-based partnership. So place-based is just defining the geography, whether that's a city or a municipality or a state, right? That's the definition of where we're going to be working within. And working towards the system improvements and improving those outcomes. I love this. This is a quote borrowed. In the best of circumstances, these backbone organizations embody the principles of adaptive leadership, the ability to both focus people's attention and create a sense of urgency, the skill to apply pressure to stakeholders without overwhelming them, the competence to frame issues in a way that presents opportunities as well as difficulties, and the strength to mediate conflict among stakeholders. Easy enough, right? Simple. So we talk about, I'm going to just give some examples of how these 7 functions, again, that are completely agnostic to homelessness. This can be applied to any large-scale systems change work, but how we applied them specifically to homeless systems work. So the first is really around community engagement and network building. So this looks like convening partners around a community level indicator to use as a continuous improvement process to improve that indicator. So what that means is, what is our campaign working on? Is it a subpopulation like youth experiencing homelessness? Is it that we want to reduce youth homelessness bottom line by 50% by a certain date, and that everyone who's working on that agrees that that's what we're working towards. That you have the necessary partners for necessary conversations. This one is really tough because as we try to get an inclusive environment where people's voices are authentically and meaningfully engaged in these conversations, if we create a table that is as big as this room, we are going to go very slowly, right? So it is not to say that all of those voices are not represented, but that you have a governance structure that allows for maybe a subcommittee, maybe an ad hoc work group, that people can have a way that they can become engaged, but you are not trying to get everyone around the same table every single time, because that is too unwieldy to move the work forward in the amount of time that is needed. And we have a sense of urgency because every day that this system takes longer is another day that someone is experiencing homelessness. The backbone is, kind of managing the logistics of the network. So they're scheduling the meetings and creating agendas and documenting the notes, doing all of those things that everyone who's attending, who has a full-time job, usually, or multiple full-time jobs, should not be asked to do something else and layer on an additional thing. And so we've borrowed that coordination has to be someone's job or else it doesn't happen. Let me just let that sit in for a second. And it's really tough. And we're often operating from the generosity of people who are volunteering to lead a thing that is well beyond what their day job is, right? We have a really strong waste no will approach. So if there is someone who wants to move this work forward, let's work with them. There are no permanent allies, there are no permanent enemies, there are just the people who can move the work forward. And then really visualizing the relationship between the backbone organization and the network of partners and how those partners interact with one another and what does their staffing and their supports look like. The second core function is really around visioning and goal setting. So how are they going to work with a group of advisors to provide the data, opportunities for action, and adapt when changing contexts and systems take place? In the US, what we were doing in January of 2025 looks very different than the conversations we were having in February and March. And we were really working with these backbone organizations to try to strengthen their resiliency because we all knew what was coming as a result of that particular administration change. It's really important that equity is at the center of this work, and I have a slide at the end, but the goal setting and the visioning has to incorporate people who are currently experiencing homelessness, who have previously experienced homelessness, who are impacted by these systems. I'll say the challenge with that is so often we invite people to a table that they have no real access to because we're all speaking in a jargon that they can't share. And so if we just tokenize someone and say, well, this is our lived experience advisory board member, they're helping inform the strategy, and the strategy is us talking a bunch of semantics, and we haven't onboarded them to any of the concepts of coordinated entry, or in our case, HMIS, or whatever it is, then that's not real representation because they can't meaningfully access that conversation. That we're setting both long-term and short-term milestones, these drivers mapped out, and they're made public to understand, and that people can see themselves in that strategy. They can see that, okay, if we want to get to ending youth homelessness by 2030, here's where we need to be in 6 months, and here's my role as a fill in the blank within that. And then that the backbone team can articulate the layers of support needed. We need the path clearing at the top. We need you to start sending your people to these meetings organization X, right? We need a group to help with the resources, to help with the meeting space, whatever that is, they can articulate those needs. And then finally, that when you have a state or a province where you might have 30 different strategic plans to end homelessness within that province, what are the themes across those strategic plans that may or may not exist that you can articulate as a way to move forward? The third one is really around partnership coordination and communications. So this is like, we're not just meeting for the sake of meeting because we want to meet. Like if nothing is happening as a result of those meetings, why are we spending our time there? Everyone's time is incredibly valuable. So just because it's on the books, if we don't have an agenda that moves the work forward, why are we here? And maybe that means dissolving the meeting. Maybe it means sunsetting it for the time being. Maybe it means you don't have the right representation. But the backbone's role is to really help understand that. Again, similarly, right, it's the right amount of partners at the right time. You don't just want to have, oh, well, here's everyone from the Salvation Army, and they have 15 representatives at the meeting, and then the city has 2. That's probably not going to get you what you need. That information is communicated both up and down organizations. So what are the takeaways? What are we leaving this meeting with and sharing within our own organization and our own teams? That there's a key set of messages about the partnership, why we're doing this work, both as maybe if you're a partner or a backbone organization. And then there's some sort of at least annual, like this is the work of the campaign, this is the work of the movement, here's what we did this year. So that people can see, why are we having all these meetings that I keep hearing about, but I don't really know what they do. The fourth is around fund development and resource alignment. So you know where the money's flowing and who it's going to and for how long. That there are gaps identified. So if you know that you have a 25% increase in seniors experiencing homelessness in the past 6 months, that you can address that with resources that serve that specific population because your data is telling you where it's heading. That we always say, like, don't let the application pass by. If there's an application out there, I don't remember all CMHC, thank you. Right? If they have something out there, everybody should be applying. Just do it and don't let it go by. And you might get something. We had an organization in Colorado where we had, for the first time, the state was funding homeless services at the level that we've been asking for 25 years. And an organization said, we just don't have time. We don't even have time to do the application. There's just so much going on. How can we possibly do this? We sat down with them and we said, you cannot let this go by. They got $1 million from the state. And then all of a sudden they were able to find time to put out $1 million worth of work, right? That funders and philanthropy are shifting the accountability towards that strategic outcome. So you can't have a city funder and a philanthropic funder and a healthcare funder and a whatever else funder all operating on different outcomes and objectives. Everybody should be rowing in the same direction from that standpoint too. And then the organization as the backbone is really providing capacity building for training and staff so that people can do this work better. 5 is really about community level impact. This is the data. Said this before, like we've got to move away in our context from the point in time as the primary data source. That data is shared and driving decisions, so that is shared broadly. It's visible, so no matter how it looks, we're sharing it publicly so that we know what's happening. It's supported, so the backbone or another organization is training people on why it's important to enter into this database and what happens to that. And then leveraging evaluation and data-oriented partners, universities, healthcare, local evaluators as objective leaders in asking those critical questions. 6, again, is about partner capacity, and where we've seen that is, trainings on housing first. Or in one of our communities where you can't say housing first because that's too woke, we call it housing with supportive services, because that's what it is. And we have both resources for both like direct service staff and those doing coordination. So how do you run a meeting? How do you facilitate an agenda? That's the kind of training that everybody needs to do this work. And that expertise is leveraged at both a staff and an organizational level for the betterment of the homeless crisis response system. Finally, organizing and advocacy for systems change. So this can include direct lobbying on local, county, state, or federal policy, advocating with and bringing partner organizations to the decision-making tables, making sure that voices of lived experience are both heard, but their story is shared to inform policy, open to all the levers of change to obtain the win. So sometimes that's grassroots, sometimes that's a media op-ed. Whatever that is, that's going to help drive the work. And gathering policy examples from other communities. So if you've got a state that has really strong housing development and they don't have any affordability requirements in there, how might they learn from a state who does? This is a really interesting one in our context because in the US, there are a lot of tax laws about what charities can and can't do regarding lobbying. And so many of our partners have had to bring in an advocacy organization because they themselves are either ineligible for that or they might be a state employee or a state department. And so they can't do the advocating, but they know that it needs to get done. So I put this one in here because equity is not like the eighth function. I believe that equity just exists within all of the functions. And so thinking about its own practices, structures, staffing, paying great attention to how are people being compensated for their time. So if you have a governing meeting and everyone there is paid because out of their day job and then your lived experience folks are not, that's a problem, right? And so how do we effectively integrate community voice into this very like top-down institution-heavy collective impact effort? Again, how do we meaningfully involve people to have access to the conversation? And how do we have tough conversations about what it looks like when you have race, class, culture, without driving away people to the table that needs to convene? Because there's no other table where this is happening. Important kind of takeaway that for me was really landing is that the backbone organization has to ensure that all of these functions are fulfilled, but they're not the ones who have to do all of them. Okay, so if you're feeling the stretch, if you are a backbone organization or an intermediary and you're feeling like I am trying to tackle all 7 of these, which are all multiplied by another 7 elements, right? You don't have to do all the doing. You just have to make sure the doing gets done. And so bring in the partners who can help make that happen. And then the second piece is that we believe that backbone organizations are a way to package these functions, but not the only way. So we have a whole bunch of communities who are not using a backbone partner in this way and are still seeing progress. And so they're doing some other kind of mixture of what that looks like. There's some slides in here that you can access from the Nonprofit Finance Fund about how these might be defined. So a partnership between a government and a nonprofit, a coalition, a standalone nonprofit, a specific government agency, or a project of another entity. We actually have across our states and our regions, I think all of these represented as part of our attempt to have a really diverse, replicable model. And then as you think about if you don't have a backbone team or a backbone organization, these are just some questions that I put in here that might help you determine if there's an existing organization or partnership, or if you are creating one from scratch, just some considerations for how you might structure that. Some of the roles on a backbone team, not going to go into those, but I do want to end on this one around backbone leadership, because I think it's really critical to understand that the type of people who are leading this backbone work look different in how they engage the systems as a whole. They're really seeing the greater system, those aspects that are less visible, and they help other people understand the greater system and the complexity of which they are a part. So they are shifting the collective focus from a reactive problem solving to the co-creation of a future where homelessness does not exist. And so often in our communities, it's so reactive, right? It's so much about whatever is happening and how are we just kind of rushing in to respond to that, instead of how are we imagining and what would this look like if it truly landed in a way that our system allowed for rapid exits into housing and that people were not experiencing homelessness for long periods of time. So happy to answer questions. Here's my contact info if you need that, and I think the slides will be made available through the app. I think we're ready for Q&A. Is that good? Cool.
Thanks so much. Are these mics live? There we go. So we have a volunteer in the crowd with a mic as well. So France is going to be able to pass a microphone around.
Hi, my name is Félix Zerono. I work with Centraide, the United Way, Greater Montreal. Thanks for very insightful thoughts. And my question goes to Ian on the backbone model. Have you seen locations, communities where there's a backbone, but it's ineffective? It's crowding the space
Yes.
and hugging that space, and doesn't leave much leeway for other organizations to take a stronger leadership. How do you deal with those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So did everybody hear that question? Folks in the back? Okay. So what do you do when you have an ineffective backbone? So I've seen a couple of elements. I've seen where, depending on the kind of history of the backbone organization, they may not actually want to be the backbone anymore, but they have been named that for so long that they're actually looking for a way out. And having a conversation with them to be able to say, like, it seems like you're not able to fulfill those functions anymore. How can we help you maybe go from trying to fulfill all of those to just like one? And that gives them a little bit of an out to be able to say, like, we're still at the table, but they're not driving in that way. I haven't seen where there are multiple backbones per se, where there's competition necessarily in our states, just because nobody wants to take on that much because of the scale or the size. I can imagine that playing out in a city. But I think in that case, are there particular niches or like a carve out of the work that everyone is needed, but we don't need both of you doing the exact same thing on what are unintentionally or even intentionally competing strategies. And so I can imagine where you might be able to reposition one of the backbones to do some different type of work in that way. And then the third is when you only have a backbone and that's who you've got, and you either have that or nothing, the question becomes, okay, how do we make do with what we've got, even if it's less than ideal? And I think that that's frankly the hardest one, because everyone else is so busy trying to move this work forward and doing direct service. Like the amount of people I work with who are also running a shelter, and I'm asking them, hey, can you come to this meeting? And then they have a client crisis, and then they can't make that meeting because obviously they have more pressing things going on. But being able to really just admit, like, do we need to take a pause on how this looks and maybe reorient a little bit in what that can be? We're seeing that in one of our states where the backbone organization is going through a really hard, very public, tumultuous kind of reorg. And everyone's like, well, if it's not you, then who is it going to be? But the partners are saying, we need to kind of wait this out, because if we try to push it forward too much, it's actually going to more negatively impact the work in the long run. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you.
I guess I have a follow-up to that in terms of multiple backbone organizations, or one who historically has taken on that role and is kind of, as the other one was saying, hugging the space. And in that hugging, hasn't really allowed for anyone else to come in who might have that niche. I'm thinking specifically, like, I'm Indigenous, I work for an Indigenous organization, we're overrepresented in the unhoused population. We have our backbone organization that's non-Indigenous. They're now starting to recognize that they should be giving, at least on the federal level and on the provincial level in some provinces, Indigenous money should go to Indigenous organizations so that they can help Indigenous folks, just because we have different way of approaching things.
Sure.
But that has not always been received well. So we'll have a backbone organization that has traditionally been there doing their Western types of things and being like, we have these token Indigenous people, so therefore give us the Indigenous money.
Yeah.
So how, do you have any suggestions on how the community, like the Indigenous agencies within a community, can engage in that conversation that doesn't become an us versus you or competitive, so that we can carve out space for both of us to be able to have say and space for our communities?
Thank you. And what was your name?
Suzanne.
Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne. So what I should have prefaced, like, that is a very Western backbone presentation, right? That is probably not going to land in a lot of contexts if you are not in that context. So just, I should have prefaced with that. I guess my curiosity would be about the backbone organization that is taking up a lot of space. Is there the ability to have conversations with them that, like, are they aware that they are doing that? And is there the ability to have those conversations that, like, we're not represented, we don't see ourselves in this strategy, we don't feel like we're being included, without coming across as, trying to create conflict. But I use this, I have an organizing background, and how I kind of frame that is like, the word confrontation means foreheads together. Like, and what are the conversations that you would literally have if you were touching someone's forehead? That's a different conversation than if you're sending an email or you're somewhere far away. Like, that assumes some level of, like, relationality instead of just transactionality. And so I would be curious, like, can you have that conversation with them and maybe they are or are not aware of the space that they are taking in leading that strategy that is not reflective of everyone in the community. And that might inform, do you then pursue a separate kind of strategic backbone that is just for the population that should be represented? Or is there a way to kind of more deeply partner? I don't honestly have a great answer for that, because I think it's a really tough one, but I'd love to continue, offline. So.
Yeah, I'm curious too if I can maybe ask a question in return about it, because I think a little bit about our work getting our lived experience table off the ground, and how some of the language around those things about meaningful engagement, things that are known that affect a particular community that others outside of that community may not know, And a lot of our work in getting that off the ground was about finding out where we can remain close enough to those we represent to authentically represent them, and where we can be legitimate enough to the system that the system takes us seriously. And we spent an enormous amount of time defining that space for our team and saying, how do we get them to take us seriously enough that they will pay us to tell them what they don't know? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't have our friends who may be very recent in their lived experience or who may be still living it look at us and say, well, they sold the fuck out.
Yeah.
And I would wonder, have you guys done any work on that of like talking about what that space is and what do those service providers that are not Indigenous not know that you know? And I'd be curious maybe just to kind of like flip that around of like, what exists in that space? And is there something that you can go back to them and say, you don't know this and it's a blind spot and it's hampering your work and there's an impact we can give you that turns into an impact that you can give us in return? Can you, like, is there room for that? Is that a thing? Or have those avenues already been exhausted? Is there goodwill? Is there bad will?
It's very complex, and even giving my name, it can put me at risk. So I would have these conversations offline.
Understood completely. Thank you.
There's another question in the back.
It's going to touch on both of your talks. If the backbone organization is politically driven, how do you maintain that the objectives of the backbone are not motivated by political ends? So that's one piece. The second piece is, if you want to include all, I'm going to say the voices that need to be included to do system design work, which is what both of your projects are kind of talking about, both grassroots and then, broader scale. How do you advocate within that? Like, my experience with Backbone is it's typically government and it's driven by an agenda that's outside of the community's collective understanding of things. And that's not necessarily the people who are implementing that backbone's desire. It is the context by which they are funded and operating. And so there may be a desire to hear, for example, the voice of lived experience or other voices, but the funding and the outcomes are being driven very much outside of that backbone organization is the best I can really come up with. And then the other, like that part of like bringing representative voices to the table. I always think about when we ask people to come and share their knowledge or bring their information to the table, I think it's so very disrespectful to ask for that if it's not actually going to be included in the outcome. So like I do see in my own community bringing different voices or a desire to bring those. Like there's a checkbox around those things, but there is not a consistent reflection back of that work that's taking place in our community. So I'm just curious from both your lenses how you would advocate. So both, I'm not the backbone and I'm not one of those representing one of those groups. I'm a collaborator who witnesses that and often thinks true allyship and really wanting to get to the objectives we're looking for requires us to stand up together, but how do we do it if the politics of the day is actually running the agenda and not the collective impact objectives that are on the screen in front of us?
Do you want to run it or do you want me to?
I'll take the political piece. Do you want to take the other piece?
Yeah, better.
Okay. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think on the political front, this is about winnable wins. And for me personally, I don't care who gets credit. I mentioned I'm coming from Denver. Denver has moved 2,000 plus people from the streets they moved 2,000 plus people from the streets off the streets. Do I want them to all have permanent housing as that destination? Absolutely. Do I think that our system should be geared towards that? Absolutely. But getting them into temporary motels and other accommodations is far better than we've ever seen it in the past. And that's a really political issue right now in our city. And so for me, it's like, great, keep going, because what you're doing ultimately gets us to the thing that we want. Unlike a neighboring city where they have taken and countered a completely opposite approach of criminalization and enforcement and transitional housing requirements and all of that kind of stuff that is not ultimately getting us to the thing that we need. And it's going to cost a lot more, and it's going to put people through a system that ultimately does not serve them. And so for me, if the kind of elective will is getting us in the right direction, I'm okay. And trying to remain apolitical. I don't think the backbone itself should be a political organization. All the stuff we've done with our states and our regions, these are like mid-level managers. These are career bureaucrats who have been through every administration, and they have figured out how to make stuff happen. That's where you want that work to take place, not where it's going to be, in the press every day.
I think that's a really good link to what I meant when I said policy agnostic. And since we ran that lab, I think the second most popular question after getting asked about what do you mean by generationally secure, are you housing seniors? And us being like, no, we want generational long timelines. People said, what the hell do you mean by policy agnostic? And it was that. It was not apolitical as in we're not taking a stance. It was apolitical as in nonpartisan and able to survive in almost any political environment. It was like one of those weird little bacteria you find in a sulfur vent at the bottom of the ocean floor. It'll live anywhere, even there. And so we worked a lot on that kind of idea and really, really disentangling impact from method. Housing first isn't an outcome. It is a way to achieve an outcome. Almost everybody we talked to wanted to see a reduction in homelessness in some way or another. Some of them had very, very brutal methods, sweep and clear, encampment shutdowns. Some of them had very, very long-term methods. Some of them had no sweet clue. They just knew that they needed to help. But everybody wanted the impact, the outcome of being a reduction in homelessness. And so we started from the common ground. And I think the collective impact model is one that's a real treat. We used it kind of a bootleg version the whole way. Because it orients people in their own unique positionality around a common impact. And using a lot of the principles, the difference between affinity-based organizing, which is I am like you, so let's work together, and impact-based organizing, which is I'm often different from you, but I want the same thing, so let's work together. And I think doing impact-based organizing or outcome-based organizing or issue-based organizing, depending on how you want to chop it up, was a really big part of it, that almost everybody out there wants a reduction to homelessness. And we could work back from outcome to prove that I can sell housing first to a fiscal responsibility small government context because it balances a budget better than almost anything else. And it doesn't take a lot of overhead from government. And that's great. And I can sell it to a very, very social impetus, strong social safety net, deep involvement kind of government because it has those things too. And I think using the impact and the outcome to validate the tool and to say this is actually proven to be the best way, let's work back from there. Let's get the facts, let's dial in the outcome, let's build you a theory of change is also how we got lived experience involvement. And that's my nice little segue that we did not structure at all and plan out. But when we were doing it, we said, if you want to get away from checkboxing, stop having checkbox-sized outcomes. If you want to stop having people with lived experience look like you're just fulfilling a mandate, don't give it a one-liner at the end of the report. If you want meaningful style engagement, give me meaningful style outcomes. Your board of directors gets 3 pages at the start of the report. Don't give me one line at the end and talk about whether the engagement was meaningful. And I say that in the most salty voice possible. People were delightful to us. They were a treat. It was good because we invited people to reframe the relationship and to say, okay, great, here's your chance. Do right by it all. like, let's hang out and spend time. And going to the overdose prevention site and the drop-ins with a living wage and lunch and saying, hey man, like, you know something I don't know, so I'm going to pay you like expert counsel to give me knowledge I don't know because you're worth it. And then going back on to the folks who are making systems changes and saying, guess what I have that you will never, ever find anywhere else. We have a unique line on things you can never know from your point of view, and let's work together to build it in a trusting framework. And I can do all that orientation around impact and say, there's a tool you haven't even heard of that can do this. And it's like showing up, if any of you have ever worked in a trade or done anything mechanically, when you suddenly find out that somebody 40 years ago invented a tool to solve the weird little problem that you have, it feels really good. And that was what we would sell as our impact a lot of the time on engagement, was just working back from saying, if my friend who really has a perspective, one of the women on our table I actually met during our lab, I interviewed her when she was living at the women's shelter. She was getting away from something. She had her 1-year-old with her. She is now housed in public housing. I go over to her apartment for lunch sometimes. Her 3-year-old kid, her partner and I went to a country music show, and they played a country rendition of the Blues Clues theme song for him. We get to go up and say, Jocelyn knows something about how the system worked for her, and she's very comfortable having her name shared. I've checked with her on this. I was texting her earlier. And we can help you access it. And we have that for you, and it can help you understand how the program worked out right for her and where others that she knows have fallen through the gaps, where those failure points were. Because learning about the success and failure points of a system and selling that impact is like, that's invaluable insight. Being able to sell it out as program evaluation, expert consideration, strategic insight from a unique perspective, and recognizing that the folks coming in, like Ian had said, not throwing them into environments either where they don't know how to code switch into boardroom, are going to get steamrolled by Robert's rules, are going to have somebody shut them down and not understand that that's a part of process rather than a dismissal of their worth, is that we do the reverse too, of making sure that people have a nice, easy, steady, deeply supported on-ramp into boardrooms and report writing, just the same as they do when they're moving into supportive housing and getting to where they need to go, that people need different tools to get there at their own pace. And comfort and sustainability was the longest road that we wanted to walk with everyone. And our table's been running it for 1.5 years because we did that work. And I think it's all easy work. You know how to do it for every other sector and every other piece of things, is just work back from those outcomes and say it's easy to do it differently. It's just hard because not a lot of us have done it.
We have that post-lunch glaze. You can see it. So maybe we'll just kind of hang out up here and...
Does anyone have any question? Okay. In the absence of further questions, we'd like to say big thank you to the presenters. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and making the presentation quite engaging for us. And to the participants, I'll say a big thank you as well for keeping the conversation going, for your questions, and for taking part in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian, will you be at a booth in the lobby later if people have questions for you?